The essential puzzle that faces us in life is the puzzle of how to be in this world without being aggressive, which is to say, without having to be trying to force things to be the way we think they ought to be the whole time. It isn't at all apparent that this is the essential puzzle that life presents us with. Generally speaking, we don't see this as being the puzzle at all. We see the puzzle as being other things. We see the puzzle as being an inverted version of that, which is to say, what I'm thinking to myself on some level or other is, how can I be successfully aggressive? How can I force things to be the way I think they ought to be and actually get them to be the way that I think they ought to be? So clearly actually getting them to be that way is another thing entirely. Every single one of us has all these ideas about how things ought to be and ought not to be. And the fact that we have these ideas creates a lot of mental activity regarding positive and negative anticipation and feeling good and not feeling good, and all this type of activity that has to do with approving of stuff or not approving of it, liking it or not liking it. That type of mental activity takes up an awful lot of our time. So we all have preferences, but the general way of things is to see that life is really a test to see whether we can get things to accord with our preferences. That's what separates the men from the boys, or the sheep from the goats, or the whatever it is. So we think. But in actual fact, that's getting it wrong. The real puzzle is, as I started out by saying, how to exist in this world in a non-aggressive way. And that begs the question, why should we have to be in this world in a non-aggressive way? Especially when it seems like being in the world in an aggressive way is how we actually assert our identity, assert our reality, and get to feel good about ourselves. So an awful lot of people would have problems with this, and they'd say, well, what kind of nonsense is that? Well, they probably wouldn't say that. They probably wouldn't even get involved in this discussion at all. They definitely wouldn't get involved in this discussion. It would hold no interest. So the question is, well, why? The question I just asked is, why should I? Why do I have to be non-aggressive? What kind of ridiculous, politically correct view is that? And the answer is, of course, that I don't have to be aggressive, and I don't have to be not aggressive. It's not that kind of a thing. It's not where we're obeying an external rule, and then we have to question, well, is this a real rule, a true rule? Did someone make it up? What's going on here? Did God make the rule? In which case we better go along with it. And this idea is very well illustrated by looking at conventional Christianity, where the basic idea is you shouldn't sin. Kind of a lot of everything just comes down to that, really, that you shouldn't sin. And the reason for that is, of course, that sinning is bad, and there's bad consequences, and it's bad anyway because it's going against what God wants for us, or for the world, for His creation. So there, straight away, we have this particular way of looking at things, which isn't an intelligent way of looking at things, because we never question anything. We just we live our lives in the shadow of this big stick, which is going to land very heavily on us if we're not careful. So even if we're not going to get physically punished, we're still going to be racked with guilt if we do sin. And this isn't to say that we should sin, it's just to say that the reasons for us wanting to do what we do, or maybe not wanting to do what we do, or maybe trying to find some way of not living life in the way that we do by default live life, hasn't got anything to do with ethics. It has to do with our own natural inclinations, which are authentically us and haven't been imposed upon us from the outside. So we could, instead of sinning, we can talk about being aggressive or thinking. If I'm thinking all the time, that's the same as being aggressive all the time. And in this kind of traditional Christian paradigm, we'd say that's bad. If we wanted to apply it, say, in this sphere, we'd say, well, that's the sin. Being aggressive is the sin. So we must make every effort not to be aggressive. But if we take this approach, we've made a fool of ourselves straight away, because the very idea that we shouldn't be aggressive is itself aggressive. So by entertaining this idea, we're being aggressive straight away. So by entertaining the idea that we shouldn't be aggressive, we're being aggressive. So unbeknownst to ourselves, we're kind of being pretty stupid. We're making fools of ourselves from the word go. And undoubtedly we carry on making fools of ourselves, because if that's the way we started off, that's the way we'll carry on. But there is a way which we can answer it without bringing in shoulds and coulds and woulds and have tos and whatever kind of superstructure of ethics we might want to bring to bear. And the best way to talk about it is to say that when we are aggressive in the world, what happens as a result of our aggression is that we create a false version of ourselves. So the one who is trying to force things to happen the way that they want them to isn't us. By definition, just as soon as we try to get things to be the way that we think they should be, that isn't us trying to do it. It is the idea that we have of ourselves, and the idea that we have of ourselves is always aggressive. So by being aggressive, we create a false version of ourselves. And not only that, we create a false version of reality. And so we have a false version of ourselves living in a false version of reality. And that situation creates a type of pain, a kind of basic fundamental type of pain. And that is the basic fundamental type of pain that comes from living the life that has been given to us, and which we falsely understand to be our life when it isn't, when it's actually a production of thought. So what I'm doing isn't really what I want to do, or I am at heart interested in doing. It's what I'm told I should be interested in, or it's what I'm told I actually am interested in. So it's like someone playing a game and saying I want to win, which people always say. But it's not the case that I want to win. It's the case that when I play the game, then the game controls me and makes me want to win, because that's how a game works. The game is a way of looking at the world which involves this very basic need to win. And when I look at the world in this way and it kind of takes over, I don't realize that I'm seeing things in the way the game wants me to see things. And so I will say ridiculous things like, I want very much to win, or it means so much for me to win, which are inauthentic sentiments. So there is a type of pain, and the pain that we're talking about here is pain of not being oneself, or the pain of spending all of one's time doing stuff that doesn't really matter. If we were to take stock and we'd say, what am I doing this crap for? I don't even want to do it. I've just got caught up in it somehow. And we could also say the pain is the pain of being alienated, both from our own true nature and from the world as it actually is in itself, rather than the version of the world that our thought processes create, which is a game. It's a kind of arbitrary, simplified version of reality, which is governed by compulsions rather than being based on the principle of free will. So everything becomes about how well we can obey the compulsions. So if we if we look at things like this, we can see that being aggressive takes us straight into this situation. The slightest act of aggression not only creates a false world, i.e. the world of how I think things should be, and that's got to be false, because whatever I think things are or should be is guaranteed to be nothing at all with reality whatsoever. It's just a projection of my thinking. So straight away I've created that false version of reality, and also I've created the false version of who I am, which is the entity which wants to obtain that outcome, and the entity which that outcome is meaningful to, because it sure as hell isn't meaningful to who I am if I'm acting out of my true nature. Because if I'm acting out of my true nature, some kind of crappy mind-produced version of the world, no matter how it's constructed or no matter how it might seem to be in my favour, is actually something of no interest to me whatsoever. It's only of interest to me if I construct myself on the basis of the assumptions or rules that world is made on. In other words, if I become a back projection of the virtual reality that the mind has created, then the back projection is the virtual me, and then that reality is meaningful to me, and within that reality some things are good and some things are bad, etc., etc. So the nature of suffering being what it is, I don't think there's going to be anyone that's going to be saying, or that will say, I'm okay with suffering, because the nature of suffering is that we're not okay with suffering. Sometimes it's said that, oh, such and such, he likes having a bad time, or he likes suffering. But that's never true. It can be the case that suffering can get results of some sort or another, so we suffer in order to get a result. But we don't like suffering. No one likes suffering, because suffering is suffering. It's a situation that's inimical to our actual nature. So it's like getting a trout and putting it in the Sahara Desert. The Sahara Desert might be fine for some creatures like camels maybe, but it's not fine for trout. So there is this pain. So when we are shoehorned into the crass pseudo-reality that the mind creates, which is society of the world that society has created. It doesn't suit us. It only suits the version of us who it says we are. It certainly doesn't suit us, because it's crass. In no way does it relate to our finer sensibilities. It only relates to our implanted compulsions and insecurities and greeds and fears that aren't us, but which take us over. So the question also becomes, the puzzle becomes, how do I extricate myself from this consensus reality, which is wholly repressive towards my actual nature, which cannot thrive in it and will not thrive in it, and is not allowed to thrive in it or even exist in it. So we create this world that denies us, and then we suffer, because the denial of who we really are equals suffering. So clearly the puzzle is, how do we dis-extricate ourselves? How do we get out again? And that remains a very tricky, a very subtle question, because straight away, even when I'm formulating that way of looking at things, assuming that I do formulate that way of looking at things, it straight away shades into aggression, because I straight away start seeing my pseudo-existence within the mind-created virtual reality, or the consensus reality, or the social game, as being a non-desirable thing, and not a right way for things to be, and that the right way for things to be is for me to be not a prisoner of this world, not a prisoner of what Philip K. Dick calls the black iron prison. So straight away, I'm doing violence. I'm looking at things in a violent way. I'm trying to change things to be the way I think they ought to be. Although I can't really have an idea of how they ought to be, because I don't know anything about that, and I never can. All I know is the pressure and the oppression of the system, or the virtual world that I'm caught up in. So really any ideas that I might have about how I'm supposed to be are pure fantasy. It's like imagining what heaven is, and we start thinking all these absurd things that, well, in heaven there must be this, and oh yeah, there's probably that. So we kind of create a ridiculous situation made up of things that we know, that we've copied out of everyday life and put into this idealized state. So heaven is just really a world that is exactly the same as this, only just the good bits, none of the bad bits. But for us to be free from the mind-created virtual reality is neither good nor bad, and there's nothing in it that we know about or relates to anything at all. So we can't be goal orientated around it. So paradoxically, it turns out that the way to practice this art of living non-aggressively is to live in the way that we are living, in this false version of who we think we are, in the false version of what we think reality is or the world is, and not see that as being in any way wrong. Not taking against it, not resenting it, not looking down on it, I suppose is a better way of putting it, because in spiritual terms we tend to look down on the earthly or the mundane or the physical or the corporeal, and get all kind of caught up in this idea of the spirit, or the idea of being spiritual beings, which is a dead end, to be trying to reject the physical world. That's actually our starting off point, and that's where we are. And so the art of learning to be non-aggressive is the art of accepting the fact that we are aggressive. And I don't mean intellectually accepting it, of course, but living true to the way that we actually are, and not having any ideas that we should be different or that we are different, but just seeing everything for what it is and living our lives not in terms of projections of how we're hoping for things to get better or we're fearing things getting worse, but taking an interest in what it actually is. And the thing about that is that when we start taking an interest in the mind-created virtual reality and genuinely, unreservedly, wholeheartedly being who we are, who we find ourselves to be, our default existence as this mental idea that we have of ourselves, as this notion of me being this self or this identity, we start to naturally see that there is more to ourselves and more to the world. So we start seeing the cracks, or the cracks start to appear when we keep our attention on the way things actually are, rather than distracting ourselves with projections the whole time about that we're going this place or going that place. When we stop thinking in terms of destinations. So it's the thinking of the world in terms of destinations that is the aggression, because a destination is something that can only be arrived at via aggression. And aggression doesn't get us anywhere because it's a projection of where we already are, or it's a projection of the self. So oddly enough, being fixated with destinations or goals is our way of always staying the same. So although it sounds splendidly dynamic to be heading after some destination or striving after some goal, that's just our sneaky way of making sure that we stay the same as being who we aren't, which is causing us to be suffering. So staying the same means perpetuating the suffering and alleviating it in some way by entertaining ourselves with fantasies of some kind of relief or redemption that can never come, because this mind-created version of ourselves, there is no relief for it, there's no redemption for it. It is never going to go to heaven. There's no happy hunting ground for it. And its existence purely depends upon its belief that there is redemption or final relief or release. So, even though no one particularly likes hearing that the self we take ourselves to be is going to be forever unredeemed and is unredeemable, when we do start to see that we've changed the conditions which allow that illusion to continue, because as I have just said, the illusion can only exist when it believes that it can transcend the suffering that is in its nature and actually get somewhere, and things can be good, and our struggle will bring us to this place, to this promised land. So once we see through those projections and we get up close to the unpalatable nitty-gritty of the fact that here I am living on behalf of this self, or taking myself to be this self, or totally understanding everything in the world or in life in terms of this self, and that self is just never ever going to change. It's just a mass of hopes and fears, and the hopes are as unfounded as the fears are. That's just the mechanism by which it hangs together. So when we do get to grips with this, and we do start living life honestly instead of intoxicating ourselves with our projections, although this seems to be embracing a picture of life which is pretty grim and lacking any kind of glamour, by doing so we actually cut off the feed, we cut off the energy supply that's maintaining this fiction, and so it starts to dissolve or explode, or maybe it cracks up, but we see beyond it or through it. And what lies beyond it or through it, or what lies in the cracks, is this state of very great freedom, or this state of wonderment that exists when we exist authentically in the world, or exist in the real world, not in our fantasies. So essentially it's a question of kissing frogs or kissing toads. Nobody wants to kiss the frog. Nobody wants to kiss the old toad, because he doesn't look that nice. But when we do embrace this negativity, it's not the end of the world. It's a good thing or a bad thing. That's how we get somewhere, by dropping our destinations and stop being obsessed with our destinations. That's how we get somewhere.